I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, which resides in the Elliott School of International Affairs of the George Washington University. Today, I'm joined by Sabina Alkire, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University. And along with our colleagues from the Human Development Report Office of the UN Development Program, we're pleased to present today's discussion of a multi-country analysis of multidimensional poverty in contexts of forced displacement by Yeshwas Admasu Bogale, who is currently research fellow at the World Bank, but is, I believe, in Copenhagen at the moment. Today's discussant is Anna Gaunt, Senior Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Officer at UNHCR. I want to thank you both for being here today. And in just a moment, I'll ask Sabina to describe the series and introduce today's speakers. But first, just a few words about our institute. IIEP supports faculty research and teaching and convenes nonpartisan discussions of the key questions facing the international community, including inequality, climate change, and global governance. This week is a busy one for IIEP. Tomorrow, Mahvash Qureshi and his colleagues at the IMF join us for a discussion of its Global Financial Stability Report. On Wednesday, our Envisioning India series brings together Sunita Narayan, Muthukumar Mani, and Lavish Bandari for a discussion of India's environmental challenges and the impact of COVID. And then on Thursday and Friday, IIEP's Washington Area Development Economics Symposium comes to you directly from our partners up the hill at Georgetown University. Last Monday's episode of Multidimensional Measurement featured Nils Grede of the World Food Programme using an MPI to assess the conditions of refugees in Turkey. Next Monday, Sabina Alkire and Fanny Kovesdi of OPHI will present disaggregations of the global MPI by ethnicity, with Marin Andrea Jimenez of UNDESA as discussant. If you miss any of our events or episodes, catch the rerun on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Sabina for her introductory remarks. Sabina?
Thank you so much, James. And thanks to all of you for joining. This promises to be a very stimulating and interesting discussion. This seminar series builds on a conversation between a metric of multidimensional poverty and different institutions who are adapting that methodology in innovative ways, applying it to new data sets, to new populations with their expertise. And so bringing a new angle and a new energy into applications of multidimensional poverty indices. And I'm really delighted to introduce Yeshwas Admasu Bogale, who, as James said, is part of a research fellow in forced displacement program supported by the World Bank with HDCR and FCDO in UK. And he's focused on forced displacement and particularly on the gender dimensions of forced displacement. And so he's focusing a lot in the refugee communities in Ethiopia and looking at also impact evaluation technologies. And his PhD comes from Heriot-Watt University in the UK with an MSc in economics from Copenhagen. So it'll be lovely to hear him present this paper, which creates new multidimensional poverty indices and compares forced displaced populations with host country populations. And the discussant for today, Anna Gaunt, as James said, is from the UNHCR Regional Bureau for East, the Horn and Great Lakes, Africa, and where she's joining from Nairobi. And she has a lot of experience in implementing humanitarian and development programs on economic inclusion, both in the Middle East and in Africa. And particularly one of her emphases is economic inclusion exchange. So bringing together NGOs, UN agencies, financial institutions, civil society organizations, and researchers that operate in the region in which she is working. And so it's really lovely to have this opportunity to engage with Anna and to hear her reflections that draw on so many other relevant conversations through the region. So Yeshwas, over to you. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sabina and James. Let me share my slides first. This paper presents a descriptive analysis of multidimensional poverty and forced displacement. It uses household survey data from 5 sub-Saharan Africa countries and compares poverty level and composition with forced displaced population and host communities. And it also compares these poverty levels by the gender of the household head. And it also explores the mismatch and overlap between monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty. This is the outline of today's presentation. I will start by providing a brief context, country context, focusing on displacement and multidimensional poverty. Then I will proceed describing the data and the dimensions and indicator used to calculate the MPI. And I will present results disaggregated by displacement status and the gender of the household head. And finally, I will present results which compares the monetary and multidimensional poverty. This is the country context. In this paper, we consider 5 countries, which are Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. These countries has common characteristics. They have experienced conflict in the past, or they are currently experiencing armed conflicts. And they also have a large number of displaced population, including IDPs and refugees. For example, in Ethiopia, the main driver of displacement are conflicts, mainly ethnic-based and border-based disputes, combined with drought. In 2009, there were more than 1.8 million IDPs, which comprise 1.6% of the population. In addition, Ethiopia is one of the largest refugee hosting country, currently hosting more than 800,000 refugees. Looking at Nigeria, the emergence of Boko Haram in 2009 combined with inter-ethnic conflict produces a large number of IDPs. In 2019, there were 2.7 million IDPs, which consists of 1.3% of the population. In Somalia, the prolonged conflict, which lasts for more than 3 decades, combined with drought and increased flooding, produces a large number of forcibly displaced population, including IDPs and refugees. In 2019, there were 2.7 million IDPs, which is more than 17% of the population. And Somalia is also one of the largest refugee sending countries. South Sudan, after the secession from Sudan, the armed conflict and intercommunal conflict starting from 2013 produced a large number of IDPs, which is around 1.6 million and consists of 14% of the population, which is very large. And finally, Sudan, the civil war, actually 2 civil wars produce a large number of IDPs. Around 5.6% of the population are internally displaced persons. And Sudan is also one of the largest refugee hosting country in Africa. And these countries are identified as in the low income country, except Nigeria, which is a lower middle income country. And by the global MPI, they have majority of poverty. For example, in Ethiopia, around 83% of the population are multidimensionally poor. In Nigeria, 46%. South Sudan, almost 92% of the population are multidimensionally poor. And Sudan, 52%, which indicates that all these countries suffer from multiple level of deprivation. So this, in the case of forced displacement, forcibly displaced population not only are affected by simple lack of income, but also they are suffering from multiple overlapping deprivation. For example, in terms of lack of education, inadequate housing, poor health, and also food insecurity and no access to clean water. So we use this multidimensional poverty as a complement to the monetary poverty. So in this paper, the analysis is based on the Alkire Foster method, which is a counting-based multidimensional poverty measure, which can be adaptable to various contexts. And this method is also flexible in terms of selection of dimensions, indicators, and deprivation cutoff, as well as the weighting structure of these dimensions and indicators. In addition, it allows the construction of individual and household level deprivation profile to identify multidimensionally poor people using a dual cutoff identification. In MEPI, we have three main statistics, K statistics, which are the incidence of poverty, H, the intensity of poverty, A, and the product of this gives the MEPI index, which is the adjusted headcount ratio. And this method has also policy relevance as it allows for subgroup disaggregation. In our particular case, it is used to disaggregate the results by displacement status, by the gender of the household head, as well as by the type of headship, de jure and de facto female-headed households. And it also used to construct the composition of poverty by each indicator showing overlapping deprivations. Now to present the data source. The data sources are from the World Bank for the 5 countries. For example, for Ethiopia, we used the skill profile survey of 2017, covering refugees living in campus and host communities living within 5-kilometer radius of a camp. And these refugees are mainly from 4 neighboring countries, including South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Sudan. For Nigeria, IDP survey of 2018 is used, which covers IDP and host communities living in 6 northern-eastern parts of Nigeria. For Somalia, the high frequency survey of 2017 with covering both IDPs and non-IDPs all over the country. For Sudan, IDP profiling survey with samples for IDP are from the Abu Shaikh and Il Salam campus, and host communities are from the neighboring and non-neighboring Al-Fashir city. And for South Sudan, we use the high frequency survey Wave 4 of 2017, and the sample are IDPs and host communities living in urban areas of the 7-10 pre-war states. And the last column shows the sample and the retained sample for our analysis. So this is the dimensions indicator used to calculate the MEPI after a consultation with the experts in the area of forced displacement and multidimensional poverty. We have 4 dimensions: education, health, living standard, and financial security dimensions. And we have 15 indicators. Since the focus of this paper is forced displacement, indicators that are more prevalent in the situation of forced displacement are also included, like lack of legal identification, physical safety, and food insecurity. And we are also focusing on gender, so indicators like pregnancy care and early marriage are also included, in addition to the usual MEPI indicators. Here, this table shows the dimension indicator and definition of deprivation with the weighting structure. All the 4 dimensions are given equal weights, which is 1/4, and each indicator within each dimension are also given equal weights. For example, in the education dimension, there are 2 indicators, years of schooling and school attendance, with a weight of 1/8 each. And the deprivation is defined, for example, for school attendance, the household is defined as deprived if any child of primary school age is not attending school up to class 6. For the rest of the indicator, the definition is similar. We use eligibility criteria and the cutoff definition to determine who is deprived and who is not deprived. This is the result for multidimensional poverty by displacement status. We have here three panels. The first one shows the H is the head count ratio. The second panel is the intensity of poverty, A, and the last panel is the MPI, the adjusted head count ratio. So if we look at the first panel, head count ratio, we see that in general, displaced population are more likely to be poor compared to their hosts or non-IDP population. And the largest poverty is observed in Somalia, both among displaced and non-displaced population, with at least 63% of the population, IDP population, identified as multidimensionally poor, and around 45% of non-IDP population identified as poor, multidimensionally poor. Looking at only the displaced population, the lowest poverty rate is observed in Nigeria, with only 23% of IDPs identified as poor. For non-displaced population, the lowest is observed in Sudan and followed by Ethiopia, with only 9.4 and 12.8% of the population are identified as multidimensionally poor, respectively. And comparing the two groups, the refugee and hosts, or displaced and non-displaced, we see a large difference in Ethiopia and Sudan. And the difference ranges from 6.3 percentage point to 34 percentage point. And the difference is significant in all countries except Nigeria. So if we see Ethiopia and Sudan, there is around 33 percentage point difference between displaced and non-displaced population. Here it is important to know that Ethiopia and Sudan, refugees and IDPs live in camps, whereas for the other three countries, IDPs live outside of campus. Looking the result of the MPI, we see similar results with the head count ratio. The highest is in Somalia, with the MPI statistics of 0.396 and 0.286 for displaced and non-displaced population, respectively. And the lowest among non-displaced population is in Sudan and Ethiopia, with 0.054 and 0.37. And the difference is like the head count ratio is significant for all countries except Nigeria, with the largest difference observed in Ethiopia and Sudan, around 20 percentage points. Looking the intensity of poverty, we see the only significant is in Nigeria, with around 3 percentage point differences, where non-displaced population are more likely to have a higher intensity of poverty compared to displaced population. Whereas in Ethiopia and Sudan, even if it is not significant, displaced population or refugees and IDPs have a higher intensities of poverty. So unpacking this intensity of poverty by intensity bands to see the deprivation among MPI poor by displacement status, we see that, for example, in Nigeria, we saw in the previous table, there was a significant difference. And you can see here is that here at least 15% of poor IDPs are deprived in at least 70% of the indicators, compared to 6% of poor hosts, which are deprived in at least 70% of the weighted indicators. For Somalia, the intensity is less concentrated, with only 45% of the poor non-IDPs and 34% of the poor IDPs having deprived in at least 50 to 59% of the weighted indicators. Looking at the higher intensity, we see that at least 70% of poor non-IDPs and poor IDPs are deprived for 70 to 79% of the weighted indicators, showing the highest intensity in Somalia. In Sudan, we see a large percentage of poor in the lower intensity, with 71% of poor hosts and 62% of poor IDPs having a lower intensity or deprived only for 50 to 59% of the weighted indicators. So in general, displaced population are more likely to have a higher intensity compared to non-displaced population using these intensity bands. This figure shows the contribution of each indicator to the MPI, taking the case of Ethiopia. For example, if we see the host graph, we see that years of schooling with 19%, followed by lack of bank account, 14%, and school attendance, 14%, contributes the largest to MPI, Ethiopia's MPI among hosts. For refugees, the largest contributor to MPI is lack of bank account, followed by years of schooling and food security. And if you see further, we see that early marriage, physical safety, and I think pregnancy care contributes more to refugees compared to host community MPI. Now, this is the census death count ratio for Ethiopia, which shows the percentage of population who are both poor and deprived in each indicator. As you can see, there is a significant difference between host community households and refugee households. And for example, if we take bank accounts, the largest difference between the two, at least 40% of poor refugees are deprived in bank account compared to around 10% of poor hosts. We will also see a large difference in terms of cooking fuel, food insecurity, and physical safety. This is for Nigeria. As similar to the previous results, there is no significant difference between the two groups, and all the indicators show that less than 25% of the poor are deprived in each indicator, both in non-IDP and IDP cases. And the largest difference in Nigeria is observed in terms of legal ID, where IDPs are deprived much more compared to non-IDPs. In Somalia, one of the largest poverty observed in Somalia, and it shows here also poor households are deprived as much as 60%, for example. At least 60% of poor IDPs are deprived in use of schooling, waste disposal, cooking fuel, and also housing. And the largest difference between IDPs and non-IDPs in the case of Somalia is observed in terms of years of schooling, where 60% of the IDPs are deprived and only 30% of non-IDPs are deprived in years of schooling. For South Sudan, there is a difference between the two groups, and the largest difference is observed in terms of electricity, where IDPs are deprived, and in general, IDPs are much more likely to be deprived in each indicator, in most of the indicators. For Sudan, it's more similar to the Ethiopian case, where there is a big difference between IDP and non-IDPs. And the largest difference here is bank account and drinking water, where IDPs are more likely to be deprived. Moving to results by the gender of the household head, this graph shows, in general, female-headed IDP households are more likely to be deprived in all countries except Somalia, where in Somalia, male-headed households are deprived among both IDPs and non-IDPs. Looking at each country, we see that in Ethiopia, among refugees, there is a big difference between female-headed households and male-headed households. For MPI, the MPI for male-headed households is 0.1, and for female-headed households is around 0.35. And we see no difference between male and female-headed households among hosts in Ethiopia. In Nigeria, there is a pattern where among IDPs, female-headed households are poorer compared to male-headed households, but among hosts, the opposite is true, where male-headed households are poorer compared to female-headed households. For South Sudan and Sudan, it's similar, where female-headed households in both hosts and IDPs are poorer, and the difference is significant in South Sudan. Now, this is the intensity of deprivation among MPI poor, male and female-headed households. Here, we see a significant difference in Ethiopia and Sudan. For Somalia and Nigeria and Sudan, it's more or less similar. They show similar intensity of poverty between male-headed and female-headed households. But in Ethiopia, we see that at least 10% of male-headed households are deprived in at least 70% of the weighted indicators, compared to just around 4% of male-headed households. In South Sudan, the magnitude is a bit higher, with 24% of female-headed households deprived in at least 70% of the weighted indicators, compared to just 17% of male-headed poor households. This figure shows the contribution of each indicator to the gender difference in MPI at country level. The positive number indicators female-headed households are worse off compared to male-headed households, while the negative number indicators female-headed households are better off. So looking at the indicators, we see that bank account, legal ID, early marriage, years of schooling, and food security are the largest contributor to the gender difference in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Sudan, where female-headed households are much more likely to be deprived. In contrast, in Somalia, years of schooling and school attendance, as well as legal ID, contributes to the gender difference, where female-headed households are better off. This is an example of the census death count ratio for refugees in Ethiopia. We see the difference between female-headed households and male-headed households are significant in almost many of the indicators, with the largest difference observed in terms of early marriage, bank account, food security, and cooking fuel, as well as housing, which indicates that female-headed households are deprived in those indicators compared to male-headed households. So we saw the result for disaggregated by displacement status, as well as by the gender of the household head. So to complement our results of the gender results, we conduct a further disaggregation by the type of headship. So we divide female-headed households with de facto and de jure female-headed households. And from the result, we see that there is no difference between the two groups in terms of head count ratio or MPI among host or non-displaced population. But looking at the displaced population, we see a significant difference between those groups in Ethiopia and in Nigeria, where in Ethiopia, de facto female-headed households are much more likely to be poorer compared to de jure female-headed households. While in Nigeria, the opposite is true, where de jure female-led households have a higher MPI index with 0.19 compared to de facto female-led households 0.158. For the other countries, even if it is not significant, in Somalia and Sudan, de facto female-led households have a higher MPI indices compared to de jure, but in South Sudan, the de jure female-led households have a higher MPI index, and the difference is large, but it is not significant. And this is mainly due to sampling issues, small sample in South Sudan. And looking at headcount ratio, we see that a 26 percentage point difference between the two groups, where around 64% of the de facto female-led households are identified as poor compared to 38% of the de jure female-led households in Ethiopia. And finally, we compare monetary poverty with multidimensional poverty. For monetary poverty, we use the international poverty line of $1.9 per day to construct the poverty rates and to compare this with the multidimensional poverty results we already have. So here we see that the mismatch and overlap in monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty for the 4 countries, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. Because of lack of data for monetary poverty, there is no, we didn't calculate monetary poverty for South Sudan. So in Ethiopia, we see a largest overlap with at least 65% of the population are either poor or non-poor by both measures. And in Somalia and South Sudan, it's around 54% and 50%. This is the overlap between the two poverty measures. While in Nigeria, the overlap is only 28%, where households are either poor or non-poor in both dimensions. And around 70% of the population are identified as only monetary poverty. So looking this further by the gender of the household head, we see similar results. In general, female-led households are poorer in terms of monetary poverty compared to male-led households, both in refugee and host community households. It is similar for multidimensional poverty. Female-led households are much more likely to be multidimensionally poverty, and the rate is the difference is very large in terms of monetary poverty between refugees and host communities among female-headed households. There is also a significant difference among male-headed households between the two groups. For multidimensional poor, there is no much difference among male-headed households. This is by type of headship and displacement status, de jure and de facto female-led households in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, in general, for both multi-dimensional poverty and monetary poverty, de jure households in de jure female-led refugee households are much more likely to be in poverty in both measures. And the difference is significant between refugee and host communities for both monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty. And this is the result from earning profile. The earning profile is constructed based on gender and the number of earners in the household. So for monetary poverty, a majority female earners and households with no earners are more likely to be poor. For multidimensional poverty, majority female earners and female single earners and no earners are more likely to be multidimensional poor. While households with male single earner or remittance recipients only are less likely to be monetary poor or multidimensionally poor. This result may be the result of gender norms in the country, and wage gap, or the disproportionate high number of females in low-paying jobs. Now, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Yeshwas, for your very thorough analysis of the conditions of refugees in the countries, in particular, the different ways in which different groups of people are poor, which can only be revealed using a multidimensional approach to poverty. So I'm quite intrigued by some of the results, but I'll turn it directly over to our discussant, who can unmute and begin her presentation on your paper. Anna?
Excellent. Yes, thank you very much. I'm coming in from a very different perspective. So you will not hear from me an in-depth discussion of the different indicators, but rather reflections of how we can apply it as practitioners of livelihoods programs across the humanitarian development nexus in the region. And I'm going to take you a little bit away from the core of this presentation, maybe first to explain a little bit the vision that UNHCR has regarding economic inclusion of refugees. Maybe worth starting that although our vision statement is very strongly focused on refugees in the region here in the East Horn and the Great Lakes region, we also focus strongly on IDPs and returnees, depending on the countries that we are supporting. Our vision is also worth mentioning, focusing on creating solutions not only for POCs, as we refer to them, which is the whole group of IDPs, refugees, and returnees together, our persons of concern, but also for the hosting communities, in order to create the social cohesion that we need, in order to create a welcoming environment, but also to make sure that the often very deprived hosting communities do not suffer further from a refugee influx. How do we get there? I think worth highlighting is that UNHCR has moved very consciously away from a project level approach to an approach where we focus very strongly on facilitation and coordination. You see here on the screen a picture that for me really says it all. It's our inclusive market systems approach that we have developed jointly with ILO, which looks at human beings as people with capital. So on the very left side of the picture, I hope you don't see it at the mirroring, you see that we look at the old school DFID model, but I think that is also very nicely reflected in the MPI that you've been presenting here, where people have got different capitals, be it their education, financial capital. So, I think here for you exemplified with the proxy of a bank account, but it can be obviously much broader, human capital, physical capital, and so forth. And through the displacement, all of this gets really shaken up, and our persons of concerns often find themselves in situation much further deprived than the hosting communities due to the very strong disruption that they suffered through the displacements. When we then look at interventions, we try to look at it across the humanitarian development nexus. And I think a lot of you have heard about the Global Compact on Refugees. You probably have also followed very closely the GRF, together with the numerous pledges that states made in the region, that NGO, INGO, private sector, and other partners have made in order to address this approach together. So how does it really look concretely? Concretely, we try to work with a multiple of stakeholders, be it at the regional level. So for us, for example, we would be working very closely with IGAD, seeing how we can support the member state commitments vis-a-vis the Kampala Declaration on Jobs and Livelihoods. but we would be also looking very strongly on how we can support key partners who want to work in that sphere, such as the World Bank when they're programming their IDA 18, IDA 19 shift, with other partners such as ILO, who are running a huge program together with us, and IFC, World Bank, and UNICEF on prospects, but also on other actors, really, to kind of, seeing how we can bring them together under joint advocacy goals, but also programmatic goals. And this is the same approach as kind of taken on the country level example, where, for example, just to state here the example of Dolo Ado in Ethiopia, we try to work across interventions where we really start with, we had a very strong private sector funding from the Alkire Foundation, for example, starting with really basic funding for the humanitarian response, moving to a livelihoods response where businesses were created, technical vocational training was funded, and so forth, to the next level, which is also covered here by interventions, to really looking at other aspects of how do we get roads to Dolo Ado, which are a hugely important aspect for an integration into the market economy that is around it, right? But also, how do we work with the regulatory environment that is exemplified here in this middle donut at the bottom on the rules and regulations, for instance, with the Ethiopian government to discuss what possibilities do we have to loosen up the encampment policies, what movement permits do we need to have in place, or in other countries, how can we work, for example, on work permits to enable economic participation of refugees. And then at the end of the slide, you see obviously the hopeful positive outcomes, improved protection, jobs, durable solution for refugees, social cohesion, dignity, and so forth. Right, but now how does it all fit together, right? Why am I telling you all of this following this discussion? I think the key aspect that we really have is the question, now how do we measure all of that? You can imagine, measuring a project is quite straightforward. You define your indicators, and we have a global livelihoods information management system where we measure very specifically project success, and use the same indicators to make it comparative for us in between countries. But we really struggle with measuring larger scale interventions. So how do we measure huge policy shifts that were made jointly with the governments, with a strong donor support, that really change refugees' life? I think that's one of the key questions that we are facing. And I think for this question, research like the one presented today is of major importance for us, because using the data that already exists provides us with a fundamentally very strong baseline where we can really see where have we been during that period, and should shifts occur because of an increased donor funding, is exemplified again in the Global Compact on Refugees and the whole burden sharing aspect that we try to encourage international donor community to come in. So it's very difficult to measure for us, but I think, if we continue cooperating with you on that, and if you are able to repeat the work that you're doing with data coming up, I think that could hopefully provide us with these bigger shifts, because ideally we don't want just to see 500 people trained on a particular training, but we really want to see these big shifts in society to ensure that our programming is correct. I think that's kind of the first reflection. The second reflection is tied in a little bit to the introduction that we had very much at the beginning. We are also facilitating in the region an economic inclusion working group that meets online on a monthly basis to discuss exactly topics like today. we do encourage our members to access relevant research, to exchange with other colleagues, in country or in other countries in the region on the projects that exist, to really ensure that we talk to each other and that we maximize the information that is available for us in the humanitarian development space, and identify also where we lack information. So I think that's for me kind of the second application of what you've been sharing today. And I know a lot of our members have also joined today the discussion. So I think it's really what you're sharing is enormously useful for colleagues working in other organizations in these countries to really use for the project programming and for donor advocacy, to really showcase why they need to do what they're doing and what other programming they will need to to develop based on your finding. I think that the third dimension that I also wanted to highlight, that I found also particularly interesting when reading through your draft report and seeing your presentation today, was also a reflection on kind of how can we use this for our sorry, I'm just stopping sharing. How can we use this for our cash-based interventions programming, for our work on social protection, but also for the work that we're doing currently with partners in the region on the Poverty Alleviation Coalition, which is based on the graduation model. And I think here it would be really interesting for us to have further conversation with you, to unpick, in detail and understand in more depth, the packaging of indicators that you have used, compare it with to the work that we're doing under the joint hub that we have, for example, with WFP, in our case in Rwanda and in Uganda. And I know these are not your focus countries, but I think it's interesting to see to see the methodologies that are used, because these methodologies are afterwards in some countries, such as, for example, in Jordan, discussed also then with the hosting government, and see, what methods they use in their social protection assessments to define a household level poverty and eligibility for financial support. In our case, cash-based intervention. So I think that's for me kind of another reflection on, how we could go about using the information that you have brought forward. And I think, maybe a last one that I kind of just want to throw out here is also the gender aspect. I found it enormously interesting to really see to see this, the multidimensional poverty on paper for women, because I think for us as an organization, as we're a protection-focused organization, a lot of our work is still coming from a case-by-case management approach. So often when we integrate women into livelihoods programming, for instance, we do it based on, be it enormously negative coping mechanism that household that the woman is using, be it, sexual and gender-based violence or other protection-driven indicators that make us, integrate women stronger into our programming. And I think, your work really makes a good case for us to push our thinking further in this humanitarian development space, and kind of go, women are probably starting, starting lower down. They, the challenges you mentioned, the education, the access to finance, and so forth. Maybe we need not only to integrate women into our programming, but design stronger women-specific programming that addresses this huge gap. But also, focuses much stronger on enabling environments. We found, for example, when we were trying to integrate women into socioeconomic zones in Jordan a few years ago, that our program was failing because we didn't have an enabling program in place. Women simply didn't know what to do with their kids, or they felt sexually harassed on the transport, right? So I think these are things that we need to think stronger about, and I think that your research hopefully will stimulate our thinking on that. And I think with these reflections, I'll end for now.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much for your comprehensive link to the real world, what's happening out there, what needs to be done, and how these tools might in fact inform action. I want to now turn it over back to Yeshwas for just to reflect on what Anna has said. But before then, I want to ask those of you who are in the audience to right now think through some additional questions or some comments that you'd like to put into the chat, and then I'll pull them out of the chat and we'll do a bit of back and forth. I do see there our colleagues from UNDP, HDRO, Yanchin and Heriberto, great to see you. Questions? Polly Lahola, I think I saw earlier from South Africa. Great to see you, Polly. And Jenny Klugman is with us as well from Georgetown. So please be formulating your questions, and it's up in your lap now, Yeshwas. Replies to Anna's comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for the interesting comments and discussions with the inclusion of refugees and with other nice comments as well. My understanding with the MPI is that when we construct the indicator is based on forcibly displacement situation, and we want to see how is the poverty level in between forced displacement and host communities, comparing these two groups, and by gender comparing female and male households. As you saw in the results, we find a big difference in some of the indicators like education, physical safety, early marriage, and sometimes also bank account. So this kind of like the decomposition by indicators gives us policy relevant results, how the practitioners focus on these indicators to improve the livelihoods of the forcibly displaced population and the host communities as well. So the MK gives us a much more clearer idea why the poor are poor in terms of forced displacement or host communities. And yeah, and I agree with all the other comments. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'll actually, Sabina, you're back from being offline for a second. Did you have a comment or a question you wanted to put forth at this time?
Yes, no, thank you so much, and apologies for my signal. Yeshwas, I think that many of us would want to probe the data set in many different ways, and I know some of the constraints, but I was wondering if it would be interesting to share with people if there were any other ways of breaking down the data sets other than by female and male headed households, because it would be interesting, you know, in these very large countries. Obviously, we can't go into detail subnationally, but to see if there are any other disaggregations that could be done, which might illuminate some of the policy relevant patterns about where policies are working well and where they are challenged. So yeah, just a little bit of a review of that I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, yes. We use the disaggregation by household aid, female aided and male aided household because of data limitation. So we have 15 indicators, of which 10 are at household level, and we have only 5 indicators at individual level. So we want to see the difference by gender of the household aid first, and to reduce the limitation of using the gender of the household, we go further by de jure and de facto female aided households. But to explore more, to see the gender gaps at individual level, now we have also doing the second paper solely focusing on gender and solely focusing on poverty and at individual level indicators. Like we have 6 indicators: education, physical safety, pregnancy care, and also the other 2 legal ID variables. years of schooling and school attendance as well. So based on the data available, we are going to disaggregate more in terms of at individual level by gender of the households. So that's the paper which is undergoing now.
Great, thank you so much. Anna, I had a question that is actually in your lap more. You noticed all the discussions of this approach that leads to the ability to see different groups of people within the refugee group and potentially understand much, much better their specific types of deprivations, the way they differ from the host population and so forth, even across regions, maybe the different ways in which people are deprived. Have you thought about how this can really help inform the kinds, maybe tweak the kinds of policies on the ground to get things done more rapidly? I'm just curious if you have thought that through, and if there's an example that you might cite of a dimension that seems to be really important, that would be great.
Yeah, I think again, maybe first of all, very important to highlight that UNHCR does not necessarily have the power to influence policies, right? I think policies shift happen, of course, thanks to enormous state commitments and often, donor commitments pulling in the same direction. But maybe very concretely on this kind of gender example, I think, where we can do the link is something that we've been, for example, working in the MENA region when we were discovering this huge diversion, particularly in Jordan, when we were trying to bring women into the labor force, and through our enormous program failures, and it was indeed, a program failure because we had, for example, job fairs where 100 women would come from the camps. They would be super interested in these jobs in qualified industrial zones. In the garment sector, 50 would sign up, and in the morning on the bus for the first visit, there would be maybe 1 or 2. And usually these 1 or 2 wouldn't meet the requirements of the companies because they were above a certain age group that the companies wouldn't hire anymore, right? So this was from us like the eye-opener. And I think back then I wish I had already more of the research that you're doing now and more understanding rather than learning it the hard way. But I think this led us, to dig a little bit deeper and start working with other partners, such as ILO to really look, what's happening? Why do we struggle so much getting women into the labor force? And I think, there was, of course, this discovery, yes, due to the conflict, we have so much more female-headed households, simply because men often die in conflict, right? They don't make it safely across the border, they are conscripted, so I think conflict often leads to a much stronger incident of female-headed households. And then secondly, that I think, refugee women, when they have older kids, they do have sometimes access to education, but very often, even when they have access to free education, they can't afford it. Like our data in Jordan was really showing that women simply didn't have money to pay for the transport or for school uniforms. When we looked at data closely, at our population data and also at our post-distribution monitoring data, we saw that female-headed households often go into debt when it's peak time for purchases for school, because suddenly they have to, to spend everything on uniforms and on books for the kids. So all of this led to us looking much more closely and starting to advocate, for example, with the World Bank for a more gendered approach to economic inclusion of refugees. And it resulted in the end in a regional program, with that specific focus. And I think, all of these discussions, and I hope, you are leading the way today into such a discussion in our region as well, is is leading to this understanding we need to look much more closer at the discrepancies between women and men in the labor force, because like we often don't even understand what works for women, right? So again, in after all these discussions in Jordan, for example, we started to look with UN Women and ILO into actual programs for women, for economic inclusion of women, and seeing which of them have got economic gains, but also which of them are safe. Because that's another question, right? Does economic inclusion of women lead to more violence? Mm-hmm. So I think, I see the research that you've presented today kind of going for me into the similar direction. It's one jigsaw piece for us to start this policy engagement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Really appreciate. And I'll pick out a couple of questions in the chat. You can see them yourselves, but I'll go ahead and pull them out. And in fact, if Polly or others wanted to come on board and just speak their question, I'm happy to let that happen. Polly, are you out there? Do you want to go ahead and just have a quick howdy?
Yes, I'm here. How are
Great,
you?
Excellent. Good to see you again.
And everybody. Well, first a comment. I have a specific question, but a comment really that the applications of multidimensionality are almost infinite, and they go into very infinitesimal detail that sharpens the eye of policy makers. So if one were to look at the 17 goals and the 200 or so indicators, while the main input of multidimensional poverty is looking at poverty 1.2.2, the applications actually are just cross-cutting right across. I mean, the applications are just exploding into the SDGs in ways that we didn't ever imagine. Now, coming to the presentation itself, which is absolutely fantastic, and the discussant in terms of just applications in matters, humanitarian aid and so on. And of course, one could imagine what happens with COVID-19. But coming to Nigeria, why is it that the dispersion and the level of disparity is so uniquely not so divergent compared to the other countries? And perhaps what does it mean for integration of refugees into normal lives of the host country? I mean, I'm quite fascinated by that particular aspect. What is it so uniquely Nigerian that suggests maybe accommodating or whatever?
Polly, thank you so much for your comment and your questions. Let me turn that over to Yeshwas. Do you have any insights on that observation?
Thank you. Yeah. Yes. The main, I think, the main thing for the large disparity between countries, for example, in Ethiopia and Sudan, the refugees and IDPs are in camps, most probably living in under-furnished household, or with less access services, education or sanitation or those kind of things, compared to those who are living outside campus. So this may explain some of the difference living in camp and outside of camp. And coming to particularly Nigeria, most of the displaced person in Nigeria is more recent compared to the other 4 countries, and they are most likely to have access to services in host communities. And before their displacement, they are also more likely to live with salaries and wages compared to the others, where they depend on agriculture and livestock. So this kind of context difference across the 4 and 5 countries may explain the disparity between these 5 countries in terms of multidimensional poverty.
So I'll turn it to, I'll just mention the quick parts of Abdikadir Abikar. If you're available and want to just have a quick question yourself, I'd be happy to go ahead and listen. But if you would like, I can summarize and ask. Great. So I'll just go ahead and summarize. The question there is about Somalia. It's just basically saying, when is this displacement crisis ever going to end? I think that's a shared question of exasperation. But the follow-up was, what are the delimitations of the project presented? So think about that question, and then let me turn it over to Jenny Klugman to ask her question as well. So Jenny, from up the hill.
Thanks very much, James. Well, it's partly a question and partly an advertisement for the larger research project of which this is part. So just to say that the World Bank, supported by UK aid, has engaged on this program to explore the gender dimensions of forced displacement. And indeed, the analysis of multidimensional policy is making a very important contribution, not least for the reasons that Anna outlined, by bringing together the different dimensions, and I think enabling kind of a high level view of kind of where are the gaps and where policymakers should be focused. And as Yeshwas mentioned already, and also Sabina, there's a second paper which is focused more on the individual level deprivations, which has a sharper focus on the male-female differences within the household. So going behind the headship concept. But let me just briefly advertise some of the other papers being done by colleagues at the bank and other universities. There are papers looking more from a monetary poverty point of view, but I think very complementary, and looking at particular household composition and how that makes a difference. So getting a much more nuanced understanding of like the reasons for female headship, the nature of female headship, and how that makes a difference. Lucia Hanmer is doing that with colleagues. I should say the overall project is being led by Lucia Hanmer and Diana Arungo. And Diana, of course, is an expert on gender-based violence. So there are several papers on different aspects of gender-based violence, both kind of multi-country studies, together with Jocelyn Kelly from Harvard, as well as kind of deeper looks in countries where we have more specific data, including the DRC. And another multi-country study, and Amalia's on the call now, on looking at child marriage and how displacement and conflict affects rates of child marriage. There are a couple of papers as well looking at gender norms, a really nice one in Jordan among female youth, another one in Colombia, and then several papers as well looking more at the livelihood side, which again, I hope will have interesting implications on the programming, because I know that's kind of the $63 million or possibly more worth more question for agencies like UNHCR and the World Bank. So work in Darfur, in Nigeria and elsewhere. So the papers are actually quite well advanced. And we're hoping that these will come out in a special issue of the Journal of Development Studies, and will also be available in various other forms later on in the year. So thanks for the opportunity, and check back on the website and feel free to ask questions, promote. We're really hoping that this research will be useful and will have impact. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeshwas.
Sorry, James, can you repeat the question, the last question?
Oh, last question. Yes, Jenny, do you want to repeat your small part of the question you have remaining for Yeshwas, and then we can go back and just ask the question about
Nigeria.
Somalia, I believe. Oh, Nigeria, yes.
Yeah.
Holly had a question.
I think Yeshwas had already answered my question, so I didn't repeat it.
Okay, great.
Basically about what we're learning from the individual level deprivations. And I guess one point that comes out quite strongly, just to give you all a heads up, is that country context seems to matter a lot. We do get a lot of variation across the countries when there's a deeper dive, which I think is an important message for us all. But Yeshwas, I don't want to totally steal your thunder, so.
And there was a question about the delimitations of the project. That's all. It was kind of a general question. you can address it or let it go.
Okay, thank you. One of the limitations of the paper is the lack of availability of data. For example, in the situation of forced displacement, some of the indicators like livestock ownership, land ownership, underemployment, this kind of indicators were included first. But after checking data across the 5 countries, they were dropped because we couldn't find data for all the 3 indicators across the 5 countries. So that is one major limitation. And in terms of Somalia, also there was one particular case where we couldn't find data for years of schooling. So at least around, I think there was around 15% of the sample were dropped. So there was a bit larger dropping out. So the retaining sample was only 83 or 85% compared to the other ranges from 93, 94 to 97%. So that is one limitation of the paper, basically lack of data for the main variables.
Well, playing on that theme, I think we have a question from MD Rahman, which was really having to do with, I think the last part of the question, refugees' presence in data sets and how, whether or not they are missing or in action in many government data sets, or whether they're available. So could you comment a little bit further on that aspect? And then there's a second part to the question, which said that there's a difference between MPI and income or monetary based approaches to poverty. And to what extent do we need to reconcile these differences, or do they just remain something that we can draw upon for directing our policies?
Okay, thank you. In terms of refugees integration with the national survey,
yes,
I think there were workers to integrate refugees to be included in the Nigerian survey. Maybe Anna knows better, but I know in JDC they are trying to incorporate refugees in household surveys. They are advanced in Kenya, maybe. Yeah. So I don't have much more information on that. But in our case, the data is specifically for forced displacement, IDPs, and host communities. So most of the time, it's not nationally representative. So it is representative for the considered sample.
Great. Anna, do you want to just chime in there for a second on that question?
Yeah, just to highlight that we're definitely working as much as possible on this approach to include refugees into national surveys. So it does happen indeed already in Kenya. There are discussions underway, I believe, or it's happening in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, and I think I might be wrong. Hopefully Burundi, but yes. So yeah, definitely very important aspect to reconcile. The data there in order to also be able to include refugees later into, or generally, persons of concern into social protection systems, at par with host communities.
Indeed. In fact, Heriberto's comment toward the end and question carries forth in this and says, to what extent can we identify IDP? And can you see the possibility of maybe a selection bias going on here? Maybe you can walk us through the identification procedure of the group of IDP. Is it possible to know more about them, short-term, long-term displacement, the cause, conflict, climate change, etc.? And we'll end on that as the last question. So, Yeshwas?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the household survey that has detailed information about why the displaced person are displaced, why they left their country in terms of the reason, conflict, climate change, also the length of their displacement. So the survey has very detailed information, and we use that data to construct our identification.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I just want to congratulate the speaker, the discussant, and indeed the secondary group of speakers, the members of the audience, for all of their contribution to today's event. We're really looking forward to next week. Please hope to see you again for measuring multidimensional poverty. Until then, see you later.